nice introduction once we start. Well, it'll just be nice or not, but it'll be an introduction. And you've turned in everything right, so it can be put in the expo, right? You have the 3 things here. Great. That's good. And we're going to have one of our students' dads, who's a policeman, come with his canine, and they're going to do a canine demonstration at the expo, so that'll be something you miss out on. Some of us are not going to be here. I'm not going to be here. It feels so terrible, but all my grandkids are like, "You're not coming to expo."
Wait, you're not?
So Abby's kids showed me all their projects on Saturday. And I'll hopefully get good video footage from everybody. Yes, I have, when you have this many grandchildren, you have to kind of make choices. So I'm going to be with one grandchild above all the others.
10
I'm going to be with 10 grandchildren, and so, what is it? 80% of my grandkids are like, I prefer these 10 this weekend.
You're ready.
Okay, we're live. Well, good morning. This is always the favorite class of mine for the research class, as the students get to present their papers. And thank you folks for coming to share and visit. And we have hopefully some grandparents on live stream or others as well getting to watch. So this isn't going to be a real long event. So I don't know which one is, so ladies first, and she said you, so last will be first and the first will be last. So you'll be first, Josh. So they'll be doing a presentation on the research paper, and the audience is supposed to pay attention. And then when they're finished, you have to ask really good questions like, is that really your work? That doesn't look like a fourth grader. So ask questions about their papers for a nice interaction, and then it'll be finished. It is being recorded, and it'll be just shown up at the expo as well. So
You should hold the mic. I have it tuned down, so if you hold it, it'll be better audio.
you have it tuned down? Well, I'm not the one doing the presentations. They are, so they're going to have to hold it?
Yeah. Right about there.
You're going to have to hold the mic, but you can't get full of stage fright because you're on stage and the mic still only records what you say into it clearly.
Be about this far from your mouth.
Your mouth should be this far from the mic. It's like an ice cream cone. You're almost going to eat it. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your love and your good purpose that you have instituted by creating us, instituting family, acknowledging that even before the foundation of the earth, we were going to be sinners in need of redemption. And I thank you that we can come to this class, which will display 2 students' research papers, or 3 if the other one record gets in, and their hard work they've done in studying different aspects of your creation and your history. So bless our time, give them strength of heart to be clear and focused in their presentations, and may you get all the glory, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, Josh, with that, I apologize. Apparently, you're going to have to hold the mic, too, so you're first.
Is this a good distance? Okay.
It hears out of the end of it, so if you have it tilted away, it won't hear it. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, good morning, everyone here, everyone watching live stream, good morning, and good day to anyone who might watch this in the future as a recording. My name is Joshua Cox. This is my oral presentation of my research paper from this school year. So basically, the goal today is to explain what my research was and what I learned from it, and hopefully you can leave with a better understanding of the work that I did this school year. So the title of my research paper is How World War I Affected the Creative Writers Who Fought. So there were a lot of creative writers during that time, and I was specifically interested in how World War I in itself affected them and changed their lives forever, but not just their lives, also creative writing in general forever. So I chose this topic because, first of all, I have a very strong interest in creative writing, and also because World War I is a very not as well talked about war. However, I noticed that creative writing is completely different nowadays than from what it was before the war, and I noticed that most of the most famous classic writers of our time were born from World War I. So they experienced it, they went through it, most of them actually fought in World War I. So that was my reason for choosing this topic specifically. So my goal in researching this was to find out, firstly and most generally, how World War I affected the writers themselves, how it changed them so that their writing was different. Something changed in their writing, and I wanted to find that out. And then I wanted to also find out particularly who it changed, the type of people, because every experience is different. So I wanted to find out, you know, the different specific writers like Tolkien and Lewis and Hemingway. They're all three very different writers who all fought in World War I. So that's my purpose of topic, and that is what I will strive to explain today. So, firstly, to arrive at the hoped-for conclusion, the hoped-for goal that I just mentioned, I needed to figure out 3 points. The first of which is the war itself and how the war specifically would have impacted the writers individually, and how the war was unprecedented, how it was different than the other wars. Why were there so many creative writers that were drastically impacted from that war specifically rather than the other ones? So I researched, and from my research it became clear that the Great War was definitely singular. The Great War is what it was called at that time. The war to end all wars was another name. It certainly didn't end all wars, and its greatness was only in its sheer darkness and tragedy. So there were many, many deaths around that time. A lot of men died in the war. Some of them then died from the Spanish influenza right afterwards. So really the world was left shaken and missing so many people around the time of World War I. So one of the other reasons that this war specifically was so tragic and so traumatizing to many soldiers is because of the forced technology explosion that was happening around the world. So before World War I, there was some technology, but you basically had muskets and cannons. It was very old war style. And then all of a sudden you had these great minds inventing machinery and tanks and machine guns and all these massive war weapons, and some things that weren't meant for war, but they turned them into weapons of war. And they were still trying to fight as if they had muskets, basically. So you had just masses of men being obliterated from these forced technologies that really tragically tore the battlefield and the personal lives of everyone who survived. So any that didn't tragically die during the war were left scarred and very much so changed by it. They were a lot of the times more unaccepting of reality. They didn't care anymore. A lot of times they were hardened, bittered. There were very few who came out of the war with still a positive, hopeful worldview. So that leads to my second point of research, which is, what were the worldviews that this war shaped in these specific writers who came out of World War I? Because obviously it goes to study these men, it goes beyond just finding out, how many tanks they saw and how that traumatized them. You have to go into their deep personal beliefs, what they believed after the war compared to before the war, so that you can actually see how this truly affected them. So there was a vast tendency to atheism right after the world. Atheism struck very hard, very fast, and that was due to a couple reasons. One of the main ones that I discovered as I researched was that the whole world, in going into World War I, used the argument, whether they believed it or not, that it was going to be a moral struggle. It was going to be something that you did for God and for country. So a lot of these soldiers, most of them were young 17, 18-year-old boys, went into the war thinking, this is not only my patriotic duty, but this is also my Christian duty, or just my moral duty. And I think that really scarred them when they saw the death and the darkness and the tragedy of it. A lot of them who weren't strong Christians or weren't Christians at all saw that and realized, this isn't moral, this is just proud leaders sending us into battle. So then a lot of them just switched instantly to atheism, which is very sad. And we see this in many writers specifically, such as Ernest Hemingway. He never said that he was an atheist, as I found out. However, his writings I found as an example, because throughout his writings you see many tendencies to just meaninglessness. He thought the world was, just tragedy after tragedy. Nothing really made sense. You just had to accept that everything was sad and there was no hope, basically. And there was one specific passage in his book where he made a reference about these poor villagers who had died during the war right after building a church. And he was bitterly talking about it as if, building a church didn't help them, in other words. So he is a pretty good example of the really bitter atheistic worldview that took over a lot of the creative writers and just generally soldiers. But as I researched, there were a few men and a few creative writers who came out of this traumatic war still holding on to, or changing later to hold on to, a Christian worldview and a hopeful worldview, despite all the tragedy and trauma that they experienced. It was a very small number, so because of that, I wanted to do a little bit more study. So that brings to my third point, which is the Christian writers, the writers who held Christian worldviews after and during the war. Because the atheistic worldview was so prominent, was so widely held at that time, it was interesting to me that some of these men did not have it, and they were very few. So instead of just studying even more the atheistic side, I decided to research more into the Christian side, since there was something unique about them, something that most of the writers didn't come out of the war with. So to explain the differences between them, atheism was obviously more common because these Christians were special. There was a very small number of them, and at their lead post-war, if you research all of the Christian writers, I would say that the top two of them were J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. They were both very respected men, very respected writers, and they were both very much so Christians. Lewis was an atheist during the war, actually, but he later converted to Christianity after Tolkien's influence on his life, actually. But Tolkien really held closely to God throughout the war, and he wrote that basically when he was cut off from everyone in his life, he was alone, he was in the trenches, and really he just saw all this tragedy going on around him. It pushed him closer to God, which I thought was very interesting, very different from what many of the atheists had happen. They saw the tragedy and they ran away from God. Tolkien saw the tragedy and ran to God, which was very interesting. So the conclusion from this that I learned and hope to prove is that the sheer impact of the Great War of World War I can be seen through a variety of people and ways. It affected them all differently. It shaped entire worldviews. It shaped entire writing habits. A lot of people would not have written stories at least the way they did had it not been for the Great War. For instance, taking Tolkien again, a lot of his great epic, The Lord of the Rings, which is widely popular around the entire world, holds themes of World War I from what he experienced, from all that hardship and yet hope that he still had during that time. So in short, in all these things, there were many changes to the world. There were many changes to creative writing, and it brought forth some writers like Hemingway and Lewis and Tolkien, who to this day, many of them are considered the standard of fantasy writing or generally creative writing. And so this never would have happened the way that it did had it not been for World War I, which, despite its sadness and its darkness, is what happened. So thank you for listening and paying attention, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Just pay attention, because the first speaker, when he's done, he gets the least questions. But then when the next speaker's coming, you can ask all kinds of questions. Your turn is over. So I do have a question for you.
Okay.
We're living in a day that, in some respects, parallels the cynicism and the increased atheism among young people because of COVID and all of the things that have fallen out from that. So you have an interest in creative writing. Do you have any, I want to say, goals or desires to impact your world? And if you wouldn't mind explaining a little bit what that is.
Sure. So yes, I agree. Nowadays world, with all the growing cynicism, like you said, and a lot of atheism among the youth, is very much alike to post-war world back after World War I. And I do have an interest in creative writing. As far as goals and being a light in this dark world, just like Tolkien and Lewis were a light in their world, I do not expect to become as such a highly known and respected author as them. However, I do hope that I will do my best, and throughout my stories I try to add a hope and light perspective that you don't see in atheistic worldviews. And I hope that if God wants to use that he would use that brightly in this dark world. So I guess that would be my goal, to just do my best while I'm not known, and if I do get known, that it would impact these atheists and cynics.
I have two questions.
Okay. So he was Anglican when he converted. So Anglican is the Church of England. It was kind of like the Catholics. It branched off of the Catholics, but it's a little different. Tolkien was a Catholic for a time, but he was very, very. I believe he was a born-again Catholic. I obviously don't know his heart, but from what he wrote, he very much so clung to God as his only hope. So.
Lewis was Anglican and from that became atheist and from that became Christian?
So I think his parents were Anglican, and he wrote that as a child he thought of God more as like a wishing well or like a wizard that he would just talk to, and God would give him fancy stuff. But then, yes. So, but then he hit World War I and just went hard to atheism, and then he came out of that and he became friends with Tolkien, and Tolkien basically proved to him that Christ is the only way. So then Lewis was saved, and then he was an Anglican, I believe, for the rest of his life.
So my second question is, thank you. Second question is, in your research of creative writing and wars, have you seen the same pattern of a drastic shift in the writings and beliefs of people throughout different wars, all the wars in history? Is that something that's traceable, a pattern, a repeating pattern?
That's a good question. So part of the reason I chose World War I is because while there might be some things like that, World War I was really drastically different than the other wars. We haven't really had other wars that brought out such highly respected writers that became writing standards for people. There have been wars that have brought out good writers. World War II had a couple good writers come out of it. But I would say, and also, I mean, Civil War time, obviously there were writers, but a lot of those I feel like were good writers before the war and kind of went off of that. But World War I was really singular in having such an impact, in my opinion, on the creative writers who came out of it and what they wrote about when they came out of it.
Three viewers at the moment.
Hello, 3 viewers.
So I have a couple more questions.
Okay.
First of all, I got to get back to my question. You mentioned this wishing well kind of dilemma that came out of his background as Anglican. And so today, I'm being hounded by the Washington Post for participating in an article they're wanting to do. And there are some wishing well graduates of Wellspring that apparently have stepped up and have some very bad things to say about us. And the first thing that strikes me is that wishing well Christianity is sort of, well, you illustrated it well with that one anecdote about these poor people building a church, and then the church was destroyed or they were killed or something, I forget what you said. But it was like a lot of good that did. And so as you did your paper and understood this dilemma, is there something particular that stood out to you that being a true believer assists and brings to the table so that you can go through hardship and difficulties instead of expecting, because I'm a Christian, then everything's going to just be hunky-dory and work out fine for me?
Yeah, that's a good question. I saw it very particularly when I was studying about how so many of these people saw the tragedy in the war around them, and their immediate thought was, wow, God must not be that great then. But then it was interesting seeing Tolkien's thought on it, how he saw it all, and he was like, oh, wow, God's really drawing me closer right now, which I think is interesting, and probably one of the things that stood out to me during my research is just that God has a plan through everything. Part of the first things that the atheists would think is that, wow, this is just craziness. There's no plan in all this. This is just an accident. So to just remember that God has a sovereign plan, and despite man's foolish actions and the tragedy that we can see, we can know that God is still sovereign in that, and he can still use us and still use hard times like that, especially to draw us closer to him. And I think that Lewis honestly probably would not have become a Christian later had he not gone through that same war. So even though it hardened him, particularly at the time, he was able to see later, this was all in a plan for my life. So hopefully that answered the question. But
Yes, thank you. Did Tolkien clearly express, I know with his Lord of the Rings series, I heard one quote from him that he tried to deny having any religious intentions at all, and then later you pointed out to me that actually finally fessed up and said,
yeah.
Did you ever hear the force of his faith that was able to see God, the big picture, and order these terrible things underneath that sovereignty of God?
Yeah, so he did say at first, well, what he said, what a lot of people quote and then they take out the rest of his statement, is that he just loved writing, so he just wrote this story. And then he read through, as he was reading through it, he realized that his worldview was shaping it. He couldn't do anything about it. He wasn't sitting there like, let me make an allegory right now. It was just spilling out because that was his worldview. And then when he realized that it was inevitable, he decided to go back through and rewrite it with a clear purpose. So he said that he really hid the messages throughout the story. That way he could kind of hook atheists or anybody that would try to read it, because they would think, oh, I'm just reading a cool fantasy story. So I think one of the clear allegory type things that I've seen in his books is his story about the origin of his world. It's very similar to the creation story. There's no evolution. There's a creator who creates it, and he's like the big powerful king. Like no one's more powerful than him. And then the bad guy obviously is an angel who used to be praising the king, but then he went and decided to try to destroy his whole earth. So I think that was a really clear picture of that intrinsic creationistic Christian worldview of the world around him, so that even when he's creating his own imaginary world, it played into that. So yeah, but I feel like there's a lot of different things like that. There's several quotes that I like from the Lord of the Rings where it'll be like a really dark time and some character will say something like, don't give up, this is what we have to do. And one of the characters says, you can't, or I think it's a famous quote from Gandalf, you can't choose what time is given to you, but all you have to do is choose how to live out the time given to you. So it really captured that view of his sovereign view of God. He knew that you don't always get to choose your life, and it's not just random chance, but what is given to you, you have to live out. So.
I'm sorry, I have two more quick questions.
Okay.
One is that as you studied and saw just how much cynicism occurred, and then these couple of guys really stepped into the fray of all this negativity, and they actually became significant because they were so few and they were speaking
Inspired me because I realized that God can use whoever He wants to, especially when it's just like 5 guys that come out of the war. I mean, it would be logical to think, with all the creative writers who came out as atheists, and some of these guys were good writers, that they would become the standards for writing to this day, but they haven't. And to this day, the standards have been these few Christian men who didn't care about what most of the world thought around them. They just followed God, put it in their writing because they liked writing. I mean, it started as a simple thing that God had given them a gift in, and they just enjoyed doing it. And then God took it and really impacted the world and others' lives, like Lewis, who became a Christian just because of it. So
the truth matters.
yes, yes.
So now this is, I'm going to ask you a terrible question, but I'm going to ask you to talk to parents, which is not very nice. I'm asking you to talk to your parents, but and to your own future self as a parent. How important, maybe how practical do you think as parents we can be with respect to really assisting in setting a standard and a vision for truth and aspiring to the good even in a day when there's so much evil and so much resistance to evil?
That's a good question. So to parents and to my future self as a parent, I would say that was one thing that stood out to me, was how Lewis's parents, they were devout Anglican, but they hadn't passed it on to him. They were very just closed off about it. They believed it for themselves, but they didn't really think that they had to worry about their children believing it. So I think that's a very serious thing. We as parents, well, not me as a parent, but as a future parent, parents should be focused on making sure that everything, even down to little things. For instance, you can kind of see it in Tolkien's growing up. The reason he was so devout was probably because of his mother. His father died when he was young, and his mother did too, but before she died, just everything that she did for them, she inspired his love for writing, because she would tell them these massive stories of dragons and all that type of stuff. But everything that she did with them had that Christian worldview behind it. It was something in her that always reminded him there was something greater out there than himself or what he experienced. So I think it's important as parents to be that world to your children, that to just be everything that they need. So you're not just another person alongside them, you're sheltering them, you're being basically how they see the world is through you. So everything you do is just pointing to Christ, and I'm blessed because my parents are very much so like that. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I just couldn't resist myself. Such a good talk with this. Thank you.
You're gonna have to put the camera way down.
Where is she?
A lot shorter than Josh. So, my research paper.
Who are you?
Okay. My name. Okay. Yeah, Josh did a really good job, and I'm not gonna. I'm gonna be very short and to the point.
We can length it out with good questions.
Yeah, everyone have questions, so it can make it a bit longer.
A lot of philosophical questions about bread.
It's really interesting. It's not like, okay, you ready? All right. So my research paper is titled "The History." Okay. My name is Mercy Cox. I'm Josh's cousin. My research paper is titled "The History and Benefits of Sourdough Bread" and is about where sourdough came from, how it works, and what food products you can make out of it. My first point that I researched was the brief history of rising bread, and I found that sourdough was discovered in Egypt when Egyptians left a mixture of flour and water out, and it caught wild yeasts and began to rise. That was the first time any kind of rising bread was discovered. Before that, they just made flatbread over fires. And so after they discovered it, it spread all over the world until everybody was using it to make their bread rise, like all over the world. Everyone had sourdough. That was it. Then I was researching the different kinds of leavening, and although sourdough was the first leavening discovered, it's not the only kind of leavening. There's chemical yeast and natural yeast. And chemical yeast is when the yeast goes through chemical reaction to produce carbon dioxide, which is what makes things rise. And natural yeast goes through a biological reaction. So, chemical yeast is comprised of baking powder and baking soda, and natural yeast is comprised of sourdough and commercial yeasts, which are active dry yeast and instant yeast, and natural yeast is the kind of yeast that people use to make bread. My third point that I researched was the chemistry of sourdough. I found that there are two main things that play an important role in the chemistry of sourdough: gluten and fermentation. Gluten is so important in making bread because it is what holds the carbon dioxide in and makes bread rise. Gluten is the result of water molecules bonding with protein molecules in flour to form a network. Fermentation is an important part in making sourdough bread because it gives bread its flavor and its rise. Fermentation is when the yeast in dough processes the sugars from the flour and turns it into carbon dioxide. The fourth point I researched was the products of sourdough. After learning so much about sourdough, I was very curious to find out what kind of foods you can make with sourdough starter, which is where the yeast in sourdough bread comes from. So I found that you can bake sourdough into almost any baked goods by substituting the flour and liquid with sourdough starter. You can add it to things like pizza to add unique flavor, or cake because it adds health benefits, makes it moister than regular chocolate cake. So when you add sourdough to a recipe, it breaks down the gluten, which makes it easier for your body to digest. It breaks down the phytates in the flour, which makes it higher in vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. My favorite part while writing this research paper was doing the research and understanding more about sourdough because I was working with it every day making bread. So when I understood how it worked, I was able to fix my bread and make it better. And then my least favorite part was writing the thesis statement and the introduction and conclusion. Okay. Are there any questions?
Explain how you did better on me than the introduction.
Because I'm very boring in my writing, and I just state what needs to be stated. That's what I think. And so that's what they're supposed to be. They're supposed to just state the facts without being interesting. Any other questions?
Did you bring us a sample of your chocolate chip cupcake?
No, I didn't. Oh, I can try to make something for Expo.
Historical question.
Mm-hmm.
Did the invention of sourdough bread spread like wildfire? Was there any trade tensions that suddenly arose?
I did not see anything about that.
Think about it, and then somebody was like, "Oh, it's pretty good, actually."
It was so it stayed in Egypt, and then it just gradually went, and it wasn't like it caused a boom. It didn't everyone's like, wait, you can make bread rise? It was really cool for the Egyptians, but I didn't read anything about how other people were shocked by it. And another cool thing is that's where the Israelites learned it, is when they were brought into captivity in Egypt. That's where they learned it. And in, I think it's Exodus, where they said that they had to have flatbread because they didn't have time for the bread to rise. That's because sourdough takes so long to rise, and they didn't have time for the 24 hours to make the bread. So that's why they had to have flatbread and all their. They were making bread dough. They would have leftover bread dough. They would keep leftover bread dough and take a little bit of that and put it into their next batch of bread dough, which is starter, what we call starter. Mhm. They would keep a bit of their old bread dough, add it to their new batch of bread, and then that's just how they did it. Mhm.
So I have a couple questions. The Egyptians discovered it.
Mhm.
Did you learn anything about how they collected it?
Collect.
Or was it just a process of always leaving it open to wild?
Yeah, so it was discovered when they accidentally left their flour and water mixture out to sit. And then it's pretty easy to keep alive, just leaving it out in the open, and it'll just collect more and more.
And you had also stated that the Egyptians were not careful about their food. They often would just leave stuff out.
Yes.
Very good at fermenting.
Uh-huh.
Whereas the other nations of the world were more careful, and they didn't leave stuff out, and they didn't ferment.
Yeah, so I read a quote by Herodotus about how everyone else in the world at that time, they were worried about their food spoiling. They were trying to keep everything fresh, eating it right away. But then the Egyptians, they would leave their food out and see what's going to happen to it. And that's how they discovered sourdough, because they left their food out.
So the Egyptians discovered it. Was there a different country that made it famous? Where perfected the recipes or using it?
One country that has amazing sourdough, and that's more in modern times, is France. They're famous for their bread and their sourdough. I'm not sure if they perfected it, but they're famous for it because they do such a good job with it. But that's more in recent times, not more ancient.
So I have a really hard question. After the Passover, when the children of Israel, for the rest of their lives, including today, they were required to memorialize the Passover and the escape from Egypt. And one of the parts of their, religious memorialization is they had to clean their house from every bit of yeast. And so as I'm listening, I've read that all these years, I've always thought of little packets of yeast. And I'm thinking, well, that's easy. You go in the cupboard, you take it out, throw it away, and then you're yeast free. But apparently, yeast is in every crack and corner, so we're talking about
Sprinkling.
how do you cock spring?
Well, yeast is also in the air, so to get everything clean, you have to wash every surface because it's on every surface. But I'm not sure if you'd be able to completely get rid of yeast in an area. I'm not sure about that because when you have sourdough starter, it's catching the yeast from the air. So.
Wouldn't they just throw away their sourdough?
Yeah, well, they might. That's probably what they did. Yeah, they probably just threw it out as well.
Would that be a beneficial thing for the dough starter to get rid of the old? Does it eventually collect other bacteria and have problems? Does it help you to restart it?
Sometimes it is possible for your for your sourdough if you don't feed it, then it'll get hungry and then it'll become weak, and then other bad bacteria will be easily invaded by bad bacteria. So that could have been a way of keeping it healthy because what? Okay, because you don't want to have. Sometimes when you have a sourdough out for a long time, it could start growing bad bacteria. So that could have been a way to keep it healthy.
Aren't you aware of certain sourdoughs that are really old, though?
Old. Yeah, so to have an old sourdough starter, you just got to keep up with it without letting it grow bad bacteria. But part of my research was, does old sourdough starter taste better? Is it better for you? And scientists did lots of experiments, and they didn't find any difference in the flavor of old sourdough versus new sourdough.
But isn't it true that different areas of the world have different flavors?
Yes, they have different yeasts and bacteria in different areas of the world. So there will be different flavors, but that's not with the age of it. It's with the different region.
So if we have different yeast in the air in Japan than we have in China.
So one example is San Francisco is really famous for its sourdough starter because it's I think they said it was because of the moist, it was like very humid, and it grew a certain kind of yeast and bacteria that made a very sour and like tangy sourdough starter. So they'll have different. So my sourdough starter tastes different than.
Do you have a name for yours?
I do, but I don't call it that. I'm bad at names. My sourdough starter is named Rilla. So Rilla, Rilla. It's because I read a book called Rilla of Ingleside, and I like the name. But,
No, I was going to say, I read that.
yeah, I like that book.
So, do you know what the oldest sourdough starter in the world is? Like, if someone's been keeping it up, do you know?
I don't know the oldest, but I think in England, someone has a sourdough library, and he's been collecting sourdough starters from all over the world, really old stuff, and you'll go into this room, and there's like these refrigerated windows with all these sourdough starters from all over the world, different ages. And I know he's got like really old stuff, but I don't know the oldest.
What, are there 70-year-old ones? Or
Oh yeah,
100-year-old?
yeah. There's like really old. I'm not sure about 1,000. Actually, they went to Egypt and they like scraped off some sourdough from an old pot, and they activated it. So I know there's a really old one, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
I looked it up, and this is what you're talking about, and it's 4,500 years old.
Yeah, so that's probably the oldest.
I guarantee you an Israelite probably ate bread from that.
Yeah, they have sourdough starters from Egypt back then. So, Israelite.
I don't know if they were in Egypt at that time. So.
Yeah, they probably.
The kind of wheat, does the kind of wheat affect how the sourdough behaves? If you are using one kind and it's used to that, and you switch to a kind with more or less gluten or something, what will happen?
So I've only tried it with whole wheat flour, like regular wheat that we have nowadays, and white flour, and I've heard that it's good for your sourdough starter. It keeps it awake to be switching back and forth between whole wheat and white flour. Now, some people, they keep it separate. They have a whole wheat flour sourdough, and they have a white flour sourdough, but I've switched mine back and forth several times, and it likes it. It gets really bubbly. And with flours, when the more gluten it has, the more it will rise because it holds the air in better, so that's how it reacts with different flours. Like white flour, it will rise so much better and be so much fluffier than with whole wheat flour. And the Egyptians were using a ancient grain, I think it's spelt. They have all these different ancient grains, and that had a lot less gluten than white flour, and so it was a lot more dense than our sourdough starter. So.
I have a question about gluten. So I don't know much about what you're talking about, so I'm confused. I hear a lot about gluten-free bread. Then I'm hearing about the value of you don't know how long it's been off.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
I don't know what happened.
Did you have some audio?
Let me play it back and see how much I have. I know I had you at the beginning.
Okay.
So, Josh talked like
A long time.
That's not nice. You got like all these questions. Did Mark Severson ever get the text? I mean, the memo or whatever? I hope I used the right.
she sent it to the correct email and I double checked with her.
Was the right email?
It was the correct email.
Okay.
Hopefully, you did everything right.
And you can send it to him afterwards. Yeah.
If they have audio.
Yeah, right.
Hopefully.
We only missed a few minutes. Mr. Gary's question about gluten was the last. Oh, good.
Okay. Should I repeat the question about gluten?
Yeah, so does gluten-free mean that you can eat all you want?
I'm not sure how I should answer that. Because two different words. Okay. Your question was about how they make gluten-free bread rise. And I'm not sure about all bread, but when I was looking to see if I could make gluten-free sourdough bread, like with gluten-free flours, a lot of recipes called for, I think it was psyllium husks? Maybe? It was one of those. No, that's a different thing. They added something to make it kind of like to imitate gluten, to hold in the air bubbles. But gluten-free bread, because it doesn't have gluten, it's very dense. So it's a very dense bread, and that's why I'm glad I'm not gluten-free.
You share your secret with Grandma because
The answer.
gluten bread is better than hers.
That was on last week.
Bah!
Just kidding.
I think what the live stream missed was whether or not gluten-free people can eat sourdough bread.
Okay.
Is sourdough bread gluten-free or not?
So the answer is, if you have a gluten allergy, just like a slight, what's it called? You just intolerance. Usually you can eat sourdough bread because it's lower gluten, but if you can't have any gluten, then you can't have sourdough bread because it still has a small amount of gluten. That's all.
We got some really fun recipes.
Good. Yeah, she has really good.
Great cornbread.
Oh, is that the cornbread I sent her?
Yeah.
Oh, that was really good.
Always Subway's out. But it's like dessert.
We just made on Sunday. I just made what was it? Coffee cake, sourdough coffee cake, and it was mainly sourdough starter instead of any flour, and it was so good. It had such a sour flavor. It was like,
Was that whole wheat?
no, it was like part whole wheat, like probably quarter whole wheat, but it was mainly white flour. Yeah.
How did you find out about sourdough?
So we have a friend, and she had sourdough starter, and Mom told me to get it and figure it out. And then it was actually, I didn't really want to. I wasn't really interested in it. And then Mom was like, I want you to do an expo project on sourdough. And so I started figuring out how to do it, and then I really liked it, and I love sourdough bread. I love bread. I've always loved bread, so then making a special kind of bread was really fun. So
And we also noticed we don't get fat.
yeah, we don't. It's harder to get fat, gain weight when you eat sourdough.
Do you have any ideas of doing sort of a sourdough bakery or something?
I have thought about that. I think it was I made around Christmas time. We were going to bring lots of sourdough bread to our grandparents' house, and it was a lot of work to keep up with everything because
We have to make a lot.
it's and then you have to make a lot, and like with yeast, everything is standardized. With sourdough, it's not. Based on the temperature and everything, it could take different amounts of time. So it would be a lot of work to do a sourdough bakery, but it's something I'm kind of interested in. Like, I think it would be really fun.
So sourdough bread would cost like 10 times more.
It costs a lot, yeah. Now, I have seen bakeries and they have a process of doing it, and they'll make the price go down because they know how to do it, and the timing of everything. But it would take a bit of time to figure out how to get everything.
It won't be as good as yours.
Well, what?
Sourdough
There's in cheap stores they will say sourdough bread, but they'll take something called sourdough flavoring, forget what it's called. They'll dry sourdough starter, grind it up, and add sourdough powder to the bread. Then they'll add yeast, and it's sourdough because it's sourdough, but it's not actually, but it has yeast, so it's cheating. But so a lot of cheap sourdough bread won't actually be real sourdough. So it'll taste slightly different, so you could usually tell.
All right, well, any other questions? We have 2 more minutes to match. Josh?
Oh!
When you make sourdough with any grain, does it require gluten? For instance, could you use starchy grains like corn or rice?
Some people have done that. It makes very dense bread. You can do it, but it's just a lot different. You would have to figure out all these different things because it's corn and rice are so different than wheat. So you could do it, but it'd be very hard. Not psyllium husk. That was the wrong word. Yeah, if you want more, and if you don't want like a dense bread, it wouldn't rise like normal bread. But if you wanted it to have air in it, then you'd add something else because it needs.
My mom's watching, and she asked me to ask you, could you just summarize what the health benefits of sourdough bread are?
Okay, so some of them. Okay, so it breaks down the gluten, so it's easier for your body to digest. It breaks down the phytates in flour, and phytates they're sometimes called anti-nutrients, and they bind the vitamins and minerals and antioxidants. So when the sourdough breaks it down, then the bread is higher in those things. And those are the main health benefits. And some people say it's easier for your blood sugar levels. There are reasons. There's like something in the sourdough starter that helps your body with the blood sugar levels. So those are the main health benefits.
Any other questions? Thank you. All right, that was great. So we're finished here, right? Thank you very much.